Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're going to be diving into, a really fascinating book, I think. It's Ludwig Wittgenstein's Blue Book. And
Oh,
it's one of those books that,
this is a good one.
it really makes you think differently about how we use language. It's a little dense, but we're here to kind of break it down for you and extract those golden nuggets.
Yeah, it's a book that leaves you feeling like you've just had like a good mental workout, But
Yeah.
Wittgenstein really challenges us to look at the ways that our language can lead us into philosophical traps. Almost like we're, caught in a maze of our own making.
Right. It's easy to get lost in those word mazes. So for our listeners, can you give us kind of a quick overview of what the Blue Book is all about?
Sure. At its heart, the Blue Book is a deep dive into the philosophy of language. And Wittgenstein wants us to understand that language isn't just a tool for describing the world. It's a tool that we use to do things in the world, to interact with each other, and even to shape our own thoughts.
That's a great way to put it. It's not just about words having meanings, it's about how we use those words in action. So where should we start with this deep dive into the Blue Book?
Well, Wittgenstein kicks things off by tackling a fundamental question. How do words get their meaning? We often think of meaning as being attached to some kind of mental picture or image, but Wittgenstein challenges that assumption right from the start.
Okay, so he's saying that words aren't just labels for pictures in our heads. What does he propose instead?
He introduces this idea of ostensive definition. Think about teaching a child the word ball. You don't give them a dictionary definition. You point to a ball and say ball. The meaning is established through that act of pointing and naming in the context of a shared situation.
That's a much more grounded way of thinking about meaning, isn't it? It's not about some abstract mental process. It's about how we use words in real-world situations.
Exactly. And this leads him to one of his most famous concepts, language games.
Okay, so what exactly are language games? Does this mean we should be taking language less seriously?
Not at all. Wittgenstein uses the term game to highlight the various ways that we use language, like giving commands, asking questions, telling stories, joking, and so on. Each of these has its own set of rules and conventions.
So it's like different tools in a toolbox. We use a hammer for one job, a screwdriver for another, and they all have their specific functions.
That's a great analogy. And Wittgenstein wants us to understand that philosophical problems often arise when we try to apply the rules of one language game to another where they don't fit.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like trying to use a hammer to tighten a screw. It's just not the right tool for the job.
Precisely. And one of the language games Wittgenstein spends a lot of time analyzing is the one we use to talk about our own thoughts and experiences.
This is where things get really interesting, right?
Okay.
Because how can we use language, which is a public tool, to talk about our private inner lives?
That's the challenge Wittgenstein grapples with. He argues that even when we talk about our most personal feelings and sensations, we're still relying on a shared language, on concepts and grammatical structures that we've learned from others.
So even when I say something like, I'm feeling happy, I'm using words and phrases that are part of a public language, a language I didn't invent myself.
Exactly. And this brings us to one of the most famous and controversial arguments in the Blue Book, the argument against private language.
Okay, you've mentioned this private language idea a couple of times now. Can you explain exactly what Wittgenstein means by that?
Imagine a language that only you could understand. A language about your own private sensations, your inner world. It's like having a secret code book for the contents of your own mind.
I could see how that would be tempting.
Yeah.
But Wittgenstein says it's impossible, right?
Right. He argues that a truly private language, in the sense of a language that only one person could ever understand, is logically incoherent. It simply wouldn't work.
I can see where this is going.
Eh.
If I make up my own private word for a feeling, how can I be sure I'm using it consistently? There's no one to check me, no shared standard to appeal to.
That's a key part of his argument. He says that in a public language, we have rules for using words. Those rules are shared, they can be taught, and they can be corrected. But in a private language, there's no such external standard.
So even if I try to set rules for my private language, the only judge of whether I'm following those rules is, well, me. And that seems pretty unreliable.
Precisely. Wittgenstein argues that without some independent way of verifying whether you're using a word correctly, the word itself loses all meaning. It becomes like a game with no rules, no way to win or lose.
So even when we're talking about our most personal experiences, we're still relying on a public framework, a shared understanding of how language works. It's fascinating to think that something as personal as language can't be completely private.
It is fascinating, and this insight has some pretty profound implications for how we understand the relationship between language, thought, and reality. We'll dive deeper into those implications in the next part of our deep dive.
It's good.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Wittgenstein's Blue Book. We've been exploring how language isn't just about representing the world. It's about acting in the world. And how even our private thoughts are shaped by this shared tool we call language.
Yeah, it's really mind-blowing to think that something as personal as language is actually deeply social. So if we can't have a truly private language, how do we even begin to talk about our own unique experiences? Like, how do we express those inner feelings and sensations that seem so personal and distinct?
Right, that's a question that Wittgenstein grapples with in the Blue Book. He argues that we shouldn't get too hung up on the idea of a sharp division between inner and outer, private and public. He points out that even our most personal experiences are expressed and understood through our behavior, our actions, and our interactions with others.
Oh, so it's not like our inner world is completely isolated from the outside world. Our experiences, even the private ones, are woven into the fabric of our public lives.
Exactly. He uses the example of someone crying out in pain. We don't need them to give us a philosophical analysis of their pain before we believe them. We recognize their pain through their behavior, their expressions, their tone of voice. We connect to their experience through a shared understanding of what pain is and how it manifests.
Right, that makes sense. We don't learn about pain by reading a dictionary definition. We learn about it through our own experiences and by observing how others express pain.
Right. And Wittgenstein argues that this shared understanding is crucial for making sense of our own experiences as well. We learn to identify and express our own sensations by participating in a community of language
It's
users.
like we're all playing the same language game, even when it comes to describing our most private experiences.
Exactly. And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of Wittgenstein's philosophy. His critique of traditional philosophical approaches to problems like the nature of mind consciousness and the self.
So this is where Wittgenstein really starts shaking things up, isn't he? He's challenging centuries of philosophical thought.
He is. He argues that many philosophical problems arise from a misunderstanding of how language works. Philosophers often get caught up in abstract theories and grand systems, when the solution might be to simply change the way we're looking at the problem.
So it's like those optical illusions, where you see one thing at first, and then you shift your perspective and suddenly you see something completely different.
That's a great analogy. He uses the famous example of the duck-rabbit illusion, where you can see either a duck or a rabbit depending on how you look at the image. Wittgenstein argues that many philosophical problems are like this. We get stuck in one way of seeing things when we need to shift our perspective to break free from the illusion.
I love that. It's like he's giving us a set of mental tools for debugging our own thinking, for spotting those philosophical illusions that can lead us astray.
Exactly. He wants us to be more attentive to the details of how we use language, to the subtle ways our words can trip us up, to the assumptions we make without even realizing it.
This reminds me of something you mentioned earlier about language games. It seems like Wittgenstein is saying that a lot of philosophical confusion arises when we try to apply the rules of one language game to another where they don't fit.
That's a very astute observation. He uses the example of someone asking, "What is the length of a rod?" The answer depends on the context. Are we measuring the rod at rest or while it's moving at high speed? The concept of length changes depending on the language game we're playing.
So context is key. We can't just assume that words have fixed meanings that apply in all situations.
Precisely. And this is where Wittgenstein's emphasis on grammar comes in.
Okay, so we're not talking about grammar in the sense of subject-verb agreement or comma placement. What does Wittgenstein mean by grammar in this context?
For Wittgenstein, grammar refers to the rules and conventions that govern how we use language. It's about the ways words connect to each other and to the world around us.
So it's like the underlying structure of language, the framework that gives our words meaning.
Exactly. And he argues that many philosophical problems arise from a failure to pay attention to grammar. We get so caught up in the surface level of language that we lose sight of the underlying rules that govern its use.
That makes me think of all those philosophical debates about the nature of time or the existence of free will. It seems like those debates often get bogged down in abstract concepts and obscure terminology.
Wittgenstein would argue that those debates often stem from a misunderstanding of how we use words like time and free will. We treat them as if they refer to some mysterious entities or forces, when in reality they're just words that we use in various ways depending on the context.
So instead of getting lost in those metaphysical mazes, Wittgenstein wants us to pay attention to the everyday ways we use language, to the concrete situations in which our words acquire meaning.
He wants us to see that philosophy isn't about building grand systems or finding ultimate explanations. It's about clarifying our use of language and dissolving those philosophical puzzles that we've created with our own words.
It's almost like he's saying, let's stop trying to be so clever and just look at how we actually use language.
He's encouraging us to be more humble, more attentive, more grounded in our everyday experience of the world.
And that brings us to another important aspect of the Blue Book, Wittgenstein's emphasis on the importance of examples.
Right. He uses examples constantly throughout the book to illustrate his points, to challenge our assumptions, to show us how language actually works in practice.
It's like he's saying, don't just take my word for it, look at these examples and see for yourself.
He's inviting us to participate in the philosophical inquiry, to test his ideas against our own experience of language.
One of the most famous examples he uses is the one about the beetle in a box.
Ah, yes, the beetle in a box. It's a thought experiment designed to challenge our assumptions about the nature of private experience.
Can you remind our listeners what that example is all about?
Imagine everyone has a box, and inside each box is something that we all call a beetle. But no one can look inside anyone else's box, so we can only talk about our own beetle.
So it's like a metaphor for our inner experiences. We all have these private sensations and feelings, but we can never truly know what it's like to experience the world from someone else's perspective.
Exactly. And Wittgenstein uses this example to question whether the word beetle actually refers to anything concrete. If we can never compare our beetles, if we can never verify whether we're all talking about the same thing, then what does the word beetle really mean?
That's a really thought-provoking question. It seems like Wittgenstein is suggesting that the meaning of a word isn't necessarily tied to some private object or sensation, but rather to the way we use the word in our interactions with each other.
That's a key insight. He's arguing that meaning is grounded in our shared practices, in the ways we use language to communicate, to cooperate, and to make sense of the world together.
This is all starting to connect in a really fascinating way. It seems like Wittgenstein is challenging the traditional view of language as a tool for representing reality, and suggesting that language is more about doing things in the world, about participating in shared activities, about creating meaning together.
That's a great summary of what we've covered so far. And it leads us to one of the most profound implications of Wittgenstein's philosophy: the idea that the limits of our language are the limits of our world.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What exactly does that mean? Are you saying that we can't think about things that we don't have words for?
Wittgenstein is suggesting that our language shapes our understanding of the world. The concepts we have, the distinctions we make, the questions we ask, are all influenced by the language we use.
So it's not just that language reflects our thoughts, it's that language actually shapes our thoughts.
Exactly. And this means that the boundaries of our language, the things we can and cannot express, ultimately limit what we can think about and what we can understand about the world.
Wow, that's a powerful idea. It's almost like our language creates a kind of invisible cage around our minds.
It's not necessarily a cage, but it's certainly a framework, a set of tools that both enables and constrains our thinking.
This reminds me of that famous quote from Wittgenstein. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world.
That's the one. It's a quote that captures the essence of his philosophy, and it challenges us to be aware of the ways our language shapes our understanding of reality.
So what can we do about it? If our language is so limiting, how can we ever hope to expand our understanding of the world?
Wittgenstein doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does suggest that we can become more aware of the limitations of our language by paying attention to its grammar, by examining the ways we use words in different contexts, by being willing to challenge our assumptions.
It's like he's saying, don't be afraid to play with language, to experiment with it, to push its boundaries.
He's encouraging us to be more creative, more playful, more curious about the ways language works.
So instead of seeing language as a fixed system, we should see it as a dynamic tool that we can use to explore the world in new and unexpected ways.
That's a great way to put it, and I think that's a good place to wrap up part 2 of our deep dive.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground today, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear more about Wittgenstein's insights and how they can apply them to their own lives.
In part 3, we'll explore some of the practical implications of Wittgenstein's philosophy, and we'll discuss how his ideas can help us to think more clearly, communicate more effectively, and live more meaningful lives. Welcome back to our deep dive into Wittgenstein's Blue Book. We've been exploring how language shapes our understanding of the world, and how it can clarify and confuse our thinking.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride so far. Wittgenstein really challenges us to, rethink our assumptions about how language works.
He does. And in this final part of our deep dive, I want to kind of explore how his ideas can be applied to our everyday lives, how they can help us to think more clearly, communicate more effectively, and even live more meaningful lives.
Okay, so let's get practical. How can we take these abstract philosophical concepts and you put them to work in the real world?
Well, one of the key takeaways from the Blue Book is the importance of paying attention to the ways we use language. We often take language for granted. We assume that our words have fixed meanings and that we all understand each other perfectly.
Right.
But Wittgenstein shows us that language is much more slippery than we think.
Right.
He does. He points out that words can have multiple meanings, that contexts can shift, and that misunderstandings are always possible.
So how can we avoid those misunderstandings?
One strategy is to be more precise with our language, to define our terms carefully, and to be aware of the different ways that words can be interpreted.
So instead of just throwing words around,
Yeah,
we should be more deliberate and thoughtful about how we use them.
exactly. Another important takeaway is the importance of asking questions. When we encounter a confusing statement or argument, our first instinct is often to try to come up with an answer.
Right.
But Wittgenstein suggests that we should pause and ask ourselves, what does this word or phrase actually mean in this context? What are the rules of the language game that we're playing
Right.
by asking these kinds of questions? We can often dissolve the confusion and see the problem in a new light.
Right. It's like we're becoming language detectives, uncovering the hidden assumptions and ambiguities that can trip us up.
That's a great way to put it. And this kind of critical thinking can be applied to all sorts of situations, from everyday conversations to complex philosophical debates.
Right. This reminds me of something you said earlier about Wittgenstein's view of philosophy as a kind of therapy.
Right. He saw philosophy not as a search for ultimate truths, but as a way of clearing up the confusion that we create with our own language.
So it's about untangling those mental knots, those philosophical puzzles that we get ourselves tied up in.
Exactly. And this therapeutic approach to philosophy can be incredibly liberating. It can free us from the tyranny of dogma and rigid thinking.
Right. It's about being willing to question our assumptions, to explore different perspectives, and to embrace the ambiguity and complexity of language.
And this openness to new ideas and ways of seeing the world can have a profound impact on our lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
It can make us more empathetic communicators, more critical thinkers, and more creative problem solvers.
Right.
And it can also help us to appreciate the richness and diversity of human experience.
I think Wittgenstein would be pleased to hear us talking about his ideas in this way.
I think he would. He wanted his philosophy to be accessible and relevant to people's lives. And I think he would be happy to see that his ideas are still being discussed and debated today.
I think so, too.
Mm.
So what's the one key takeaway you would want our listeners to remember from our deep dive into the Blue Book?
I think it's this. Language is a powerful tool. It can be used for good or for ill. It can clarify or confuse. It can unite or divide.
So we need to be mindful of how we use it.
Exactly. We need to be aware of its limitations, its ambiguities, its potential for misunderstanding.
And we need to use it thoughtfully, responsibly, and with compassion.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And I think it's a fitting conclusion to our deep dive into Wittgenstein's Blue Book.
I agree. It's been an illuminating journey. And I encourage our listeners to continue exploring Wittgenstein's ideas on their own.
There's so much more to discover, and I have no doubt that his work will continue to challenge and inspire us for generations to come.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Ludwig Wittgenstein's Blue Book. We hope you found it enlightening and thought-provoking.
And we hope it's inspired you to think more carefully about the power and the beauty of language.
Until next time, keep those brain cells buzzing. And remember, don't just think, look,